It was just another typical afternoon for Malik Johnson, the kind of day where nothing special was supposed to happen, the kind of day when most people, if they even noticed him, would have quickly dismissed him as just another teenager hanging out on the corner. In a small town like this, it wasn't uncommon to see young people leaning against street lamps, chatting with their friends, or simply passing the time. Most of them, like Malik, had nothing to prove. They weren't looking for attention, they just wanted to be left alone. But Malik wasn't just any teenager. He was different. He had learned over the years that people liked to judge others before they knew the truth. They'd see someone like him, black, young, a little rough around the edges, and immediately assume they knew his whole story. They thought he was just another troublemaker, a product of a broken system, someone whose future was already decided before he even had a chance to prove himself. What they didn't know, what they could never know, was that Malik held a secret that could change everything. Hidden beneath the seams of his worn jacket, tucked safely into the inside pocket, was something no one had expected him to possess. It wasn't a weapon, and it wasn't money. It was something far more powerful, something that could destroy lives, unravel reputations, and, more importantly, expose the very hypocrisy of the world around him. It wasn't that Malik had ever wanted to be part of some big reveal or to cause trouble. He wasn't interested in fame or the spotlight. But sometimes life has a way of pushing you into situations that you didn't ask for. And Malik had reached that point. Today was different. Today wasn't going to be just another lazy afternoon. Today, everything would change. Malik's thoughts were interrupted as he glanced over at his car, parked just across the street. It was an old model, nothing flashy, nothing to impress anyone. But to Malik, it was more than just a car, it was his. He had worked hard for it, saved up for months, doing odd jobs around town, taking whatever work he could get. His car wasn't just a mode of transportation, it was a symbol of everything he had worked for. It was freedom. But even though it was his, even though it was paid for with his sweat and effort, it wasn't safe. Not in this world, not with the way things worked in this town. As Malik stared at his beat-up car, the weight of the situation began to settle in. He could feel the tension building inside him. Today was the day everything would go down. He had been through so much already, being judged, underestimated, treated like he didn't belong. But today he was going to show the world just how wrong they were. He wasn't some random teenager hanging out on the street corner. He wasn't a statistic, a label, or a stereotype. He was Malik Johnson, and he had a plan. But the road to today hadn't been easy. The last few weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions, each day building up to this moment. Every time Malik had stepped outside, it felt like the world was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. He couldn't remember a time when he wasn't looked at with suspicion or doubt. People in his neighborhood knew who he was, but they didn't really know him. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Malik's thoughts turned to the events that had led up to this point. It wasn't just the judgment from the people around him that had built up to this moment, it was the system itself. The unfair treatment he had experienced, the way he had been overlooked, mistreated, and made to feel invisible. It wasn't just the cops who treated him like he didn't belong, it was everyone. The teachers at school, the people at the store, even some of his so-called friends. They all assumed they knew who he was, but they didn't. None of them had any idea what he was capable of. And today, he was going to make sure they found out. Malik's hands tightened around the keys in his pocket. They were cold, almost as cold as the people who had judged him without ever taking the time to understand him. His grip on the keys was steady, his mind focused. There was no turning back now. He had come too far. From where he stood, he could see the street corner that had become a part of his everyday routine. The corner where he'd wait for his friends, the corner where he'd just kill time, trying to forget the world for a few minutes. But it wasn't just any corner, it was the corner where he'd first crossed paths with Officer James Franklin, a cop who had made it his mission to keep an eye on Malik, and not in a good way. Franklin was the type of cop who assumed the worst about anyone who looked like Malik. Every time Malik passed by him, it was like Franklin was looking for an excuse to stop him, to question him, to make him feel small. It didn't matter that Malik wasn't doing anything wrong. Franklin saw a black teenager, and in his mind, that was enough to make Malik a target. But Malik was done running. He was done playing the part of the quiet teenager who always got picked on. Today, he was going to take control. Today, he was going to show everyone, including Franklin, that he wasn't someone to be messed with. As Malik stood on the corner watching the cars pass by, he saw Franklin's patrol car slowly rolling down the street. Malik's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the adrenaline starting to build. Franklin hadn't noticed him yet, but Malik knew it was only a matter of time before the cop's eyes locked onto him. That's when it would start. The questioning, the accusations, the judgment. But Malik was ready. He wasn't going to let Franklin or anyone else dictate his life anymore. The time for waiting was over. The time for being overlooked was over. Today was the day that everything would change. Malik glanced one last time at his car, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself a small smile. The truth was, he didn't need anyone's approval. He didn't need anyone's permission. He was about to do something that would make the world take notice. And as Franklin's patrol car pulled up, Malik took a deep breath, ready to make his move. But not everyone was ready for what was about to unfold. Not everyone was prepared for what was going to happen next. For the last few months, Malik had been living a nightmare. And it wasn't the kind of nightmare you'd wake up from. It wasn't a bad dream that would disappear once you opened your eyes. This was real. This was happening every single day, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The source of Malik's nightmare had a name: Officer James Franklin. Franklin had made it his mission to keep an eye on Malik. To him, Malik wasn't a young person with a future or a chance at a better life. No, to Franklin, Malik was nothing more than another black teenager who was bound to cause trouble. He had made this assumption long before Malik had even opened his mouth to speak. And it wasn't just one bad encounter. It wasn't just a one-time thing. For the past few months, Officer Franklin had made Malik's life miserable, using his power and position to make sure that Malik knew he was always watching. It started out small. At first, Franklin would pull Malik over for no reason at all. No speeding, no broken tail light, nothing. Just stopping him because he could. He'd look Malik up and down, give him the "what are you up to" stare, and ask a series of questions that made no sense. Questions like, "Where are you headed, kid?" and "What are you doing here?" The questions weren't meant to get answers. They were meant to remind Malik that he didn't belong, that he was out of place, that he was just another problem that needed controlling. Sometimes Franklin wouldn't even bother with questions. He'd just look at Malik's car, shake his head, and remind him, "People like you aren't supposed to drive cars like that." His words weren't just an insult. They were a slap in the face, a reminder of the broken system that always seemed to be working against Malik. It wasn't just Franklin. It was the entire world, the world that told Malik time and time again that he was less than everyone else. Malik had tried to ignore it at first. He tried to keep his head down, not make waves, but it was hard. It was hard when every time he stepped outside, every time he started his car, he knew that Franklin was waiting for him. Waiting to make his life harder, waiting to remind him that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how hard he tried to stay out of trouble, he would always be a target in Franklin's eyes. But that afternoon, something was different. Something in the air felt heavier, more oppressive, like the storm was about to break. Malik could feel it in his bones, and as if to confirm his suspicions, it didn't take long for Franklin to show up. It wasn't the usual slow roll-by. It wasn't the usual just checking in kind of encounter. This time, Officer Franklin was driving down the street with purpose. There was a cold determination on his face. His eyes were fixed on Malik, and Malik could tell that something wasn't right. He had seen that look before. It was the kind of look Franklin gave when he was ready to take things too far, when he was about to make things much worse than they had to be. Malik's heart skipped a beat as Franklin's squad car pulled up. The tires of the car screeched slightly as the officer slammed on the brakes, making a sharp turn to park right beside Malik. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't an accident. Franklin had come for him, and Malik knew this wasn't going to end well. The sound of Franklin's door slamming shut echoed through the empty street. Malik didn't flinch, though. He stood tall, his hands slightly clenched by his sides, but he didn't move. He wasn't going to make it easy for Franklin. Franklin stepped out of his squad car with that same cocky swagger. His boots hit the pavement with a heavy, deliberate thud, and Malik could feel the tension in the air growing thicker. He could see the officer scanning him, trying to gauge his reaction, waiting to see if Malik would flinch or back down. He wasn't going to give Franklin the satisfaction. The officer's eyes narrowed when he finally spoke, his voice louder than usual. "Hey, kid!" Franklin shouted, his words harsh and grating like a warning. "Your car's been reported stolen." Malik's stomach twisted in confusion. "My car? Stolen?" he repeated, his voice low but filled with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" His mind raced. His car? Stolen? How could that be? He'd just parked it there minutes ago. It had been his pride and joy for months now. Sure, it wasn't brand new or flashy, but it was his. He had worked hard for that car, saving every penny he could. He'd even passed up hanging out with friends just so he could scrape together enough money to pay for it. And now Franklin was standing here, accusing him of driving a stolen vehicle. Malik's eyes flicked to his car, parked just across the street, then back to Franklin. He knew something was wrong, but he wasn't about to let this cop get the best of him. Not today. Not when everything was about to change. But before Malik could get a word in, Franklin had already begun marching toward him, his steps heavy and full of purpose. The officer wasn't interested in hearing Malik's side of the story. He wasn't interested in the truth. He had already made up his mind. And in Franklin's eyes, Malik was guilty. It didn't matter that there was no proof. It didn't matter that the car was clearly not stolen. Malik's presence, his skin color, the fact that he was in this neighborhood, those were all the reasons Franklin needed to treat him like a criminal. "Get your hands where I can see them!" Franklin barked, his tone sharp, his voice booming across the street. Malik froze for a moment. The world seemed to slow down. He felt the blood rush to his head, his heartbeat thundering in his chest. The world was closing in on him, and the officer's words felt like chains wrapping around him. "Now!" Franklin shouted again, his face twisted with anger. Malik's mind raced. What was he supposed to do? What was the right thing to do in this moment? Should he do as the officer asked? Should he comply and risk everything he had worked for? Or should he fight back, knowing that the consequences of defiance could be severe? He wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. He wasn't about to back down. "Calm down, man," Malik said, trying to keep his voice steady. He didn't raise it, but his words were firm. "You've got the wrong idea. This car isn't stolen. I've got the paperwork to prove it." But Franklin wasn't listening. He wasn't there to listen. He wasn't interested in any of Malik's explanations. He was there to make a point, to remind Malik who had the power. And Malik knew it. He knew that this wasn't just about the car. This wasn't just about an accusation that would be easily cleared up. No, this was about something much deeper. This was about control. This was about who was allowed to live freely without fear. And Malik was about to be forced to learn just how much that control would cost him. Malik's heart raced, but he kept his calm. His thoughts were a whirlwind, trying to make sense of what was happening. As Officer Franklin roughly cuffed his wrists, Malik's mind couldn't help but flash back to simpler times. Times when he could walk down the street without feeling eyes on him. Times when his biggest worry was schoolwork, or whether he'd make it to the basketball game on time. But now, things were different. Now his life was tangled up in lies, judgment, and the constant fear that someone, like Officer Franklin, would see him as a problem just because of who he was. He tried to keep his breathing steady. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He wasn't the criminal here. He didn't deserve to be treated like one. And yet, as Franklin's hands pulled his arms back and the cold metal of the cuffs clicked into place, it felt like the world was telling him otherwise. "Don't make this worse, kid," Franklin muttered, pushing him harshly against the side of the squad car. The officer's voice was cold and filled with authority. It was as if Malik had no choice in the matter, as if he was just another thing to control. "I'm doing you a favor by not taking you in right now." Malik didn't reply. He couldn't. He could feel the hot sting of frustration rising in his chest, but he knew it wouldn't do any good to argue. Every time he tried to reason with Franklin, the officer shut him down. Every time he tried to speak up, Franklin shut him out. But this time felt different. This time it felt like there was something more at play. Malik's gut told him that something wasn't right. As Franklin continued to push him into the car, Malik's eyes caught something in the reflection of the squad car's shiny black boots. His breath caught in his throat for a split second as he realized what he was seeing. The reflection wasn't just the street or the sky, it was the rearview mirror of his car. His mind was suddenly flooded with a new thought, a thought that sent a chill down his spine. The wheels in his head started turning, connecting dots that had never crossed his mind before. Could it be possible? Could Officer Franklin have been the one who put in the stolen car report? Was it Franklin who had set this all up? Malik's pulse quickened. It wasn't a simple thought, but now that he had considered it, he couldn't ignore the possibility. Why else would Franklin be so sure that his car was stolen? Why else would the officer be so eager to accuse him, so ready to pull him over without any proof? The idea kept turning over in Malik's mind, and every time he thought about it, the more it made sense. Franklin had been watching him for months. Every time Malik turned a corner, every time he drove down the street, Franklin was there. Why would he do this? What did he have to gain from framing Malik?